and welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio. This is Alex McHugh, and for our first episode of 2024, I interviewed Mikayla Novak and Akiva Malamet on their co-authored paper, Gender as a Discovery Process, Social Construction, Markets, and Gender. This was published in Cosmos and Taxis, Volume 11, Issues 11 and 12. For those who are not familiar, Mikayla Novak is a senior fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She is the author of Inequality, an Entangled Political Economy Perspective, and Freedom in Contention, Social Movements and Liberal Political Economy. Her research work has been published in a range of academic journals, including Research Policy, Constitutional Political Economy, Review of Austrian Economics, Journal of Institutional Economics, and Journal of Public Finance and Public Choice. Mikayla's research interests include Austrian and evolutionary economics, public choice, entangled political economy, economic sociology, public finance, and regulatory economics. Mikayla is also contributing editorial board member of the Cosmos and Taxis Journal, and she's edited several special issues of academic journals. Mikayla is the Associate Executive Director of the Entangled Political Economy Research Network, or EPERN, an international network of researchers with interest in advancing studies of entangled political economy. And don't worry, we will be getting into tons of entangled political economy today. Listeners will likely be familiar with Akiva Malamet. He's a returning guest to the show and previously appeared in our June 2020 episode. He was there to discuss his work on nationalism and identity formation. Akiva is currently contributing editor at Unpopulist and is an MA candidate at Queen's University. He is also a longtime friend of the Center for a Stateless Society. This was a very interesting conversation to record, and I was really excited to get into the many interwoven strands of scholarships that are at play both in this piece and in the discussion you're about to hear. Enjoy! So with all of that said, thank you both so much for being here, taking the time to chat with me today. Is there anything that you would like to say to our listeners before we get started?
I just wanted to say, Alex, it's great to be on this podcast episode, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss our paper in depth. So thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having us, Alex. It's good to be on the podcast again, and it's great to be on with Mikayla to discuss this paper.
Wonderful. Yeah, this is a topic sort of near and dear to my heart, so I'm quite excited to get into it. Before we get into the meatier questions, I thought it would be good to go through some definitions. So most of our listeners are probably familiar with these ideas, but I wanted to start by having y'all sort of define two concepts that seem very important to any discussion that we're going to have here. And so those two concepts are spontaneous order, or spontaneous orders, and discovery processes. And so whoever wants to start, whichever one you want to start with, how would you all define these concepts in terms of how you use them in the paper?
So the concept of spontaneous order sort of has a venerable sort of tradition in sort of classical liberal and libertarian thought, and so the fundamental sort of idea is really neatly encapsulated right at the outset of theorising about this concept by the Scottish Enlightenment economist Adam Ferguson, who referred to those sort of patterns of sort of human sort of made sort of orders, which are not the sort of the result of any design on the part of any sort of single individual sort of existing within society, but is actually a sort of an emergent bottom-up sort of patterning of interaction by multiple people. And so the significance of the spontaneous order concept is not only does it sort of lend sort of liberalism or libertarianism ammunition, intellectual ammunition in terms of responding to, let's say, sort of socialistic economic ideas to the effect that you can sort of design or plan a sort of society in a totalizing way. But we actually argue here that this idea of a spontaneous or emergent order has applications beyond economics. It branches out and extends into sort of culture, informal norms. Gender is a part of that. So really what this sort of concept is suggesting is that as a result of individuals and groups coming together to interact over an array of shared meanings about the world, including our sort of gendered world, we actually come about sort of emergently bringing a state of order rather than chaos. And what's important here is that Akiva and I see this idea of spontaneous order linking very neatly to an idea of social construction, because there are people actively engaging with each other with respect to the meanings and the understandings and the practices of gender. So if I can then sort of just very briefly talk about the sort of discovery process, which is another term. So spontaneous order very much allows for the possibility of human agency, right, in terms of the contributions of agency in bringing about what we would observe as a broader sort of order of social, cultural affairs, gender being a part of that. Discovery really, to my way of thinking, encapsulates sort of the role of human agency within this sort of broad complex of spontaneous order. Now, to be fair, this idea of this discovery process is actually given a few different names by sort of classical liberal thinkers in the modern age. So we can think of, obviously, Hayek refers to market competition as a discovery procedure. So that's sort of the closest sort of descriptor of the term. But also there are others. Michael Polanyi, the scientist and classical liberal philosopher, talks about an exploration process undertaken by individuals within society. Society doesn't preclude, or social order doesn't preclude, the possibility for individual exercise of agency to bring about novelties in the world through an explorative process, right, that can be observed by others, critiqued by others, carried through in the world. James Buchanan has a different nomenclature which is consistent with this idea of agency. So he talks about the distinction between sort of natural man and artifactual man, with the emphasis on discovery being included or encompassed by this idea of artifactuality. So what's the relevance of the discovery process? Well, by engaging in one sort of interpretation of gender, and we can sort of get into sort of definitions about gender very soon, I can imagine. By engaging in such a process, it is possible for individuals, gender entrepreneurs, gender experimenters, to be able to reveal something to the wider world about gender identity, gender expression, that isn't previously known or appreciated by their contemporaries. So the discovery process is really about the role of agency within this broader emergent or spontaneous order.
Thank you. Yeah, that I think really got into what I wanted to do here, which is there's so many different terms that are used within this area of thought, and that was a great layout of, okay, here are all of these different terms. They mean something very similar. I'm going to challenge myself to one day host a podcast where Michael Polanyi is not mentioned. But I think that was a great way to frame it. Akiva, is there anything you want to add about definitions here at the beginning, either with these concepts or with others that you think are important to understanding more of what we're going to talk about in a moment?
Yeah, so I think Mikayla did a great job of giving us a sense of the different ways that these terms have been used by different thinkers. I think I always, in terms of the emergent spontaneous order, try to think about it in terms of decisions that people make independently, out of their own volition, and then other people choose to copy them, and it becomes a stable social pattern, as opposed to something that an individual told everyone what to do or how to behave. So my favorite example, because I'm a heavy metal fan, is that no one told all heavy metal fans to wear black t-shirts. Some of them decided that wearing black t-shirts was expressive of the culture and the music that they wanted to be a part of. And then everyone else decided that that's kind of how they wanted to express themselves too. And essentially it became a kind of weird cultural uniform for that community. And so there's a similar kind of pattern where you see in gender where no one told us that men don't wear makeup and that women do, but there were some women who chose to wear makeup, and then that became part of the way that people who understand part of some of the markers of femininity.
Thank you. Yeah, and that anticipates what we're about to get into, which is turning to the history of gender and sex and all of that. But I really love that example of metal communities. I've never really thought about what it would be like to be that one metalhead who's really into pastels. But I'm sure that person exists out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
For
and if
sure.
I could just sort of jump in
Mhm.
on that, we should sort of be cognizant of the fact that what Akiva says is absolutely on the mark, in that sort of the spontaneous order sort of connotes voluntariness rather than command, right? So this distinction between cosmos versus taxis, which is ironically the name of the journal in which our sort of paper had appeared in. But we should sort of understand that there are certain sort of spontaneous orders that may not sort of necessarily lead to sort of benign or sort of beneficial results. There are certain spontaneous orders in the world that may sort of bring about undesirable results. And in response to observations and feelings and thoughts and values to the effect that spontaneous orders have brought about undesirable results, brings us the discovery process by which people will consciously act to modify or vary whatever sort of norms or practices. And I think this has a high degree of relevance to gender. Gender is not a set of commands. Gender is a sort of set of meanings, values, and understandings that are the result of agreements. And this is indeed why you get multiple perspectives of gender identity and expression, which can be signified in things like clothing, makeup, ways of being, knowing, and doing. So I think the even the example of metal, like for example the spontaneous order of the mosh pit, right, or wearing sort of dark clothing. I mean, it just sort of reveals that we have spontaneous orders really littered, throughout our everyday world.
Yeah, and I think that's great to acknowledge right now, very early. Something being the result of a spontaneous order doesn't necessarily mean benign or perfect or good or any of that. And that's why it's continually being upgraded. So with that, the next thing I wanted to get into was sort of definitional as well, looking at what is gender, what is sex. And the way I had this phrased is, so when exploring why our experiences and expressions of gender and sex as well, which we can talk about in a second, but when we're exploring these experiences and expressions, why are they so rapidly and continually in flux? And what should we keep in mind about the history and, I guess, the science of sex and gender when we're looking into these questions? So, to sort of paraphrase that a little better, what do y'all think is important to know about both the discussion of sex and gender outside of this particular treatment of it, and the history of how we have approached these things, both academically and within the broader society, whatever you think is more relevant?
So I think the first most basic thing to recognize is that there is a distinction between sex and gender. That sex is a series of biological descriptors of male and female. What gender is a set of cultural artifacts, various ways of behaving and doing and thinking, body language, mannerisms, clothing, things like that, that help describe and identify someone as a member of a particular social category. Now, both of these items we think are socially constructed. That is the way that we understand what puts someone in a particular category, and what the features of a category are functions of the way that society has chosen to understand that category. And so what counts as male or female will be dependent on what kinds of things we think count as male or female, or in between. Androgyny is defined by the defiance of male and female norms. And so ultimately, the main things I think to take away is A, that there is a distinction between biological sex and cultural gender or social gender, and B, that cultural and social gender are socially constructed inventions that are not, again, are spontaneous orders, are not intended. No one told everyone that men and women should behave in a certain way or dress in a certain way, but it kind of emerged as a product of interaction. And of people choosing to behave in a particular way that then establish certain continuing social patterns. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. We try to emphasize the ways in which people can express their agency, but there are certainly negative aspects to be talked about as well.
Yeah, and if I could just sort of add to that, I think that's a sort of brilliant encapsulation of the distinction between the sort of two concepts of gender and sex. So I think, this is an important ongoing sort of subject for discussion and debate. I mean, there certainly seems to be a backlash where people are insisting that, sort of trans identities, for example, are not authentic because of this idea that gender is reducible to your chromosomes or some sort of other biological marker. So this idea that sort of gender and sort of sex are actually distinctive sort of concepts. I think, to my way of thinking, at least, as an effective counter to this idea that really we are nothing. Our gender is nothing more than our sort of chromosomes, XX, XY, even variations on that, which obviously sort of do exist. Akiva had made this sort of point very well that that gender is an exemplar of a social construct, and that is manifested along an array of behavioral, dispositional, presentational, signifying categories. Right, as Akiva said, things like body language and clothing and the way in which people sort of carry their corporeal sort of selves in the world, and so on. So on and so forth. So I think it's important to think about that. Another sort of interesting aspect here, and why I think in our paper we really sort of want to emphasize the concepts of gender entrepreneurship and a sort of gender as a sort of discovery procedure, is that it's well known, at least in the sociological discipline, that there are a range of sort of phenomena in the world that the people experience or feel as something akin to a structure, something that appears rather static, is difficult to adjust or alter. Gender might be one of those. So in some sort of certain senses, people will probably conventionally sort of feel that sort of the binarized gender identity is a concretized or naturalized fact, right? And sort of people go with that, not fully appreciating, I think, the point we're trying to convey in the paper, and other people have attempted to convey, that the existence of structure right? We're all born into the world, and we sort of see the world around us, and it has a sort of has the qualities of structure about it. That doesn't preclude, along various margins, even along substantial margins, the opportunity for individuals who are dissatisfied with any elements of gender qua structure to go about proposals for changes to various elements of that structure, whether it be in terms of your gender expression or identity. So, I think, we're sort of advancing at what we would actually think to be a fairly sort of a neat categorization of what gender and sex is, but we do have to sort of reckon with the idea that, well, these concepts are actually, well, complicated. And so we have to sort of take into account those sort of considerations that, for many people, sort of gender sort of feels naturalized, concretized, has a structure about it. There is then this sort of argument that's sort of creeping into our political discourses that, sort of gender is nothing more than nature or even nurture. I think and I hope that our sort of paper makes a sort of a modest contribution towards sort of addressing those sort of issues in the sort of the political economy stylings as we present it.
So yeah, thank you both for getting into that. It is, as you say, Mikayla, very, very complicated. And, I am hopeful that you all's work and, other work similar can push back against this idea that, gender and sex are the same thing. And it's this, as you said, concretized structure that can't be changed. I do have sort of a follow-up question here. So Mikayla, you did mention that there are, as we're increasingly becoming aware of, it's not just XX and XY, there are variations, there are all sorts of things that we normally think of, or I guess historically have thought of as clear markers of sex that are turning out not to be as clear as we thought. And I guess my follow-up question here is, as our understanding of sex gets more and more complicated, do you think that it's going to still be relevant and useful to have this distinction, this hard distinction between gender and sex? Or as we are coming to understand sex as something that is more socially defined than we previously thought, is that going to become a problem for this distinction? This is a little far afield from y'all's particular work, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. So I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts on that.
It's difficult to say, Alex. What the sort of the future of social or public opinion might be with respect to these. I mean, there are certainly academic contributions, not only in sort of medical science, but in social sciences, for example, and Fausto sort of Sterling, for example. We refer to her briefly in our paper in a footnote, I believe, who sort of refers to the quite sort of complicating nature of biological sex in itself. I think, all really one can really do here is probably make, in the sort of spirit of Friedrich Hayek, a bunch of sort of pattern predictions which might readily be refuted. I think certainly the sort of development of sort of science and social understandings with respect to these will continue to evolve. And I think, for better or for worse, these sort of changing, shifting sort of understandings with respect to both categories and sex and gender will elicit public and political responses. I hardly see that development that we see in our contemporary age shifting anytime soon.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Mikayla just said. I think one thing that is interesting to look at is, especially as we can make more modifications to different aspects of our physical selves, to our biology, and this is something that Jason Kuznicki picks up on in his paper, contribution to our gender volume, talking about the possibility of transhumanism as a intersection with transgender issues, then the classification of what counts as male and female is going to become even more complicated, or what counts as gender is going to be more complicated. And again, I would point people to Anne Fausto Sterling's work on, as Mikayla mentioned, on sex, biological sex, as a complicated classification issue in and of itself, that makes these questions even more difficult. It's hard to predict where that will go culturally, but I suspect that as we always have forces of progress and forces of reaction. And so when these things become more disentangled, more complicated, there will be people at the same time who are seeking to naturalize, who are seeking to essentialize these categories and make everything less complicated and less subject to variation and uncertainty than they would otherwise be.
Yeah, and I guess that's sort of the difficulty of doing work in this area of sort of spontaneous orders and discovery processes, is that as humans, we sort of all want things to be a little simpler. It's difficult to look out at the world and accept it's just that it just is complicated. So I appreciate y'all getting into that. I know it's a little, like I said, a little far afield from y'all's work, but I think it's relevant given the discussions going on right now about whether we separate sex and gender and all of that. So with all of that out of the way, I think we've laid a pretty good groundwork for the main claims of the paper. And your work, as far as I can see, makes two sort of rather large claims. The first, that we've hinted at a little bit, is that gender as a discovery process carries a normative weight. So by encouraging acceptance and experimentation, what you all call gender entrepreneurship, I believe, this is a good for society, right? The second sort of big claim that I see is the idea that liberalism, properly construed, offers a robust framework for both understanding gender and for morally upholding the value of gender expression and identity. And so with those two claims, the first is somewhat intuitively clear to me, and we've, like I said, sort of hinted at what that means already. The second, however, seems to depend quite a bit on definitions, right? And so I want to get into that second one first. And I'd like to ask sort of what is meant by liberalism here, and what is, I guess, the broader point being made, for instance, for folks for whom liberalism leaves a bad taste in their mouth, right? So if we could start with that first one, what do we mean by liberalism, and why is that the framework that y'all have chosen to move forward under?
So this is a wonderful question that could probably last us for many days, if not years, to sort of think about a sort of a comprehensive definition of liberalism. And it's probably not possible, given that there are so many sort of gradations of liberalism as a system of thought, and the idea of liberalism itself is subject to an evolutionary process. But I guess in my own research, and I trust that it's carried through in this paper, I basically sort of think about so liberalism is sort of conveying a number of sort of key commitments. So this would be an acceptance rather than a rejection or a problematization of markets as a sort of a method of economic coordination. So, the emphasis on competition and openness. I mean, that's especially important to the liberal creed, that we sort of have open, competitive, free and freed markets. I'll get to the implication of freed in a minute. Another sort of commitment is that of a limited, at least a limited, constitutionally constrained government. Now, even here, we're going to sort of get into some complication, of course, because there is actually a sort of spectral array of perspectives within liberal thought itself about just how extensive government should be in terms of size and scope. So you can have anything from a anarcho-capitalist sort of position, which says, sort of nothing that embodies the mechanistic apparatus of the state as we know it today, through to, even some people will describe themselves as sort of welfare liberals. So people will debate, for example, as to whether someone like John Maynard Keynes, or let's say sort of the Cologne school of German economic thought, which gave emphasis upon the need for a welfare state, is sort of encapsulated within liberalism. So you can see here, Alex, that we can have a sort of finely grained debate about that, even in its own right. But then the sort of third and final key commitment of liberalism, then broad brush, as I would define that, I would put it to you, is that liberalism encapsulates social openness. So something about liberalism I really want to sort of emphasize here, and this is an interpretation of liberalism that might be sort of amenable to the minds of your listeners, and this is the idea of radical liberalism. That the C4SS, for example, Jason Lee Bias has sort of very neatly encapsulated in the past, and I effectively agree with his interpretation of sort of liberalism. Liberalism, certainly in its sort of original intellectual spawnings, was a radical creed, that sort of resisted both socialistic and conservative or aristocratic sort of modes of privilege within society, and that sort of gives us special emphasis on sort of social discoveries, the openness of social innovations that gives us freed markets, right, which are untangled from state regulatory and fiscal fetters. Now, all of these sort of concepts, as much as they're high level as I express them, do have relevance to the particular case in which Akiva and I have put forward. Our interpretation of liberalism is, we would argue, the radical interpretation of liberalism that you and your colleagues have sort of put forth over a long period of time, an idea of liberalism as radical, but also emancipatory as well. Emancipatory for people who may traditionally or conventionally be sort of marginalized or stigmatized for the very wish to express their inherent right of human agency to signify, indicate, express, identify gender in ways that they might wish to do in their own lights, and potentially in ways which contravene the informal norms, even formal laws. We know that sort of aspects of gender identity and expression, if not in the contemporary age, and certainly historically, certain elements of gender have been codified in laws. We've even had, for example, a few years ago in the US and many other places around the Western world, sort of debates about sort of gender and how it intermixes with marriage, and that was codified in sort of governmental statute. So this idea of liberalism that we have of a radical emancipatory disposition is one that actually allows freedom space for people to engage in gender entrepreneurship, to engage in the revelation socially and culturally of diverse expressions of gender identity, and so forth, so on and so forth, that might well contravene sort of conventional stereotypes, but provide utility, provide satisfaction for those who wish to be gender outlaws, who wish to be sort of dissenting on gendered grounds.
Yeah, I think that did a very good job of
expressing just how complicated liberalism as a term is. And I think it's great to shout out Jason Lee Bias. Folks who haven't listened to our last episode before this, the last episode of 2023 is Corey Massimino with Jason Lee Bias. And one of the things I've always found interesting is at C4SS, we have this sort of range of views on liberalism going all the way from folks like Jason to folks on the other side where I often would put myself in the category, right, of being someone who sort of moved on from the idea of liberalism to sort of identifying as just an anarchist. And then we talk more about this version of liberalism, this way of casting it, and I go, okay, well, I agree with all of that. This all sounds very good. And so I just sort of as an aside, wanted to shout out something interesting that happened recently at C4SS. So we did a call for commentary on Israel and Gaza. And Kevin Carson wrote a response that I think surprising quite a lot of people ended in a sort of defense of radical liberalism. And so I can see why liberalism defined in this way, right, taking the parts of the tradition that you all have, fits very well with what you're trying to do. I guess I would ask as sort of a follow-up, have you seen pushback on this already? And if so, how do y'all deal with the, I guess, less emancipatory historical moments of liberalism, or what people call liberalism? And what I mean by that, is the pushback on sort of allowing things to work themselves out, in the sense that when we see folks who are marginalized or oppressed, we want to do more than just let it work itself out, right? And so, yeah, I guess my question here is, have you all seen that sort of pushback, and sort of what is the answer when folks say, well, it's great that people can be gender entrepreneurs, but we should be doing more to help folks who are marginalized or oppressed?
So I think there's nothing mutually exclusive per se about helping people who are marginalized and oppressed with gender entrepreneurship. But as liberals who are skeptical of the state, and I expect that listeners to this podcast are skeptical of the state, we think that it's very hard to help people through managing and planning a society, through regimenting and controlling what people can do, by following some central plan that's meant to apply to everyone, but cannot possibly apply to everyone because it doesn't have access to all of their different decisions and preferences and desires. And so their issue has less to do with whether we have a desire to uplift the oppressed, which I certainly do, and Mikayla certainly does. And I think I talked about this with you last time, Alex. But with what kinds of tools we use to make those ends happen in the world. And so that's like really the fundamental divide, I think, between statist liberals and non-statist liberals in this respect. And, when we talk about letting things be, I think it depends on what kind of thing we're letting be. When we're talking about, for example, state regulations that block trans or gender nonconforming individuals from accessing gender affirming care, then that's something we should do something about. Those are regulations that we should get rid of. That's not a state affairs. That's just kind of a natural progress of voluntary social interaction. Whereas when we talk about patterns of, let's say, sexism or gender discrimination in an informal space, that's something that I'm skeptical of that we can cure with statist policies, but I'm nonetheless critical of those behaviors, and think that what we need are competing spontaneous orders, cultures that support gender uplift, in contradistinction to spontaneous orders that promote gender subservience and subordination.
Yeah, I'll just sort of add to this what Akiva has said. So the general sort of proposition in the end is that sort of the liberal creed is surely one that sort of carries the normative proposition that we should just let people live. Certainly to the extent that these activities of living don't clearly harm sort of other people, and it's not at all clear to me that sort of divergent expressions of gender or enunciations of gender identity actually sort of serve any harm really to others who choose not to engage in that. And to be sure, this sort of idea of spontaneous order, it doesn't have a single unifying telos or purpose, and so the gender as a spontaneous order sort of not only encapsulates the freedom and the right of individuals, I expressed them earlier as gender entrepreneurs or gender outlaws, to sort of express gender in a way that is oppositional to that of the stereotype. But the spontaneous order can also embrace those who actually wish to sort of draw upon and adopt sort of, let's say, the sort of binarized sort of gender sort of conception of being, knowing, and doing. To live clearly as male or female. A spontaneous ordered process sort of allows for sufficient freedom space to allow all of these sort of different gradations of gender to basically coexist in the sort of same spaces and the same time. And speaking of spaces, actually, we do emphasize in the paper the importance of polycentric sort of locations and situations and scenes. And what do we mean by polycentricity? Well, polycentricity just refers to multiple sites of not only of decision making, but of also of power as well, that is non-statist and it's diffuse. Sure, I mean the sort of governmental organizations may well be sort of regarded as part of a polycentric sort of situation abroad, but it's not limited to that. We don't live, at least in our sort of contemporary situations here, in sort of totalitarian sort of conformist societies. And so thus we have polycentric orders of alternative commercial and non-commercial sites, venues, places where people can get together, and if they so wish, they don't have to, if they wish, they can express gender in a creative, innovative range of ways.
Yeah, I think the last point about polycentricity is very important, that if we're concerned about making sure that people are protected from harm, are being able to emancipate from their circumstances, one way to do that is to try and plan society for emancipation, and somehow try to turn every space into an emancipatory space. I think that's very difficult to achieve, if not impossible. But another possibility is to provide alternative spaces that compete with spaces of oppression and subordination. And so what you get are alternative spaces that allow people to express themselves, to be part of a community, and so on, without imposing through its own hierarchical structure of the state new ways of relating to one another.
And so here provides a liberal compatible analytical window to sort of think of, for example, Michel Foucault's idea of heterotopia. So polycentricity provides individuals with the collective wherewithal and the individual agency to generate and create and maintain a whole array of alternative spaces that can be their own safe spaces or however else defined, in which they can express gender. And what we have is a complicated and diverse coexistence along gender lines.
Yeah, I really love the idea of bringing polycentricity into this. I think, Mikayla, when you said that word, I was like, oh, okay, this is sort of the answer to the critique of approaching these things through a liberal framework, right? Is we have this desire to, sort of bring everyone along, make sure that all people have the ability to express themselves as they wish at all times. And it's sort of pie in the sky to say, what if we woke up tomorrow and that was the case? Whereas I think being thinkers in political economy, right, tend to approach things as marginal, right? We look on the margins. We look on how can this be improved in a very, very small way or changed in a very, very small way iteratively. And polycentric social orders sort of allow us to do that, right? Allow us to experiment, allow us to have, as you were saying, Mikayla, maybe a heterotopia over here and something very different over there. And as long as there's, sufficient freedom to move between the two, um, I like the way that sort of pans out as a goal for the world. Is there? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to jump in here. I just wanted to make a sort of point of clarification. When I'm using sort of the word liberal, it can probably quite closely sort of map to the American term libertarian. I'm not using the word liberal in the kind of the US political sense, which means like a social democrat or kind of a left progressivist sort of sense. So, I admit my sort of my failings of being an Australian, and so we sort of take our interpretation of liberal to be consistent with the classic British kind of interpretation of the term. So when we're sort of talking about all this sort of these insights about polycentricity, this is actually liberalism, right? At least in the sort of the way that I've been expressing it throughout, because it's in contradistinction to socialism and conservatism, which doesn't allow sort of people to live on meaningful agential margins. Both socialism and conservatism have unnerving habits of trying to sort of constrict the margins through norms and through governmental statute and regulation, ways in which people are to live. So this idea of polycentricity is very much liberal as I'm interpreting it. So I hope that sort of provides a point of classification. So when I'm using the sort of word liberal, I'm meaning it in the sort of the British or the European sense, which might sort of more roughly correspond with the sort of libertarian kind of posture in the US.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that is a good note. Definitely the understanding I was operating under. Like, yes, we're talking about liberalism, not the not the sort of U.S. political version, but always good to shout that out. With that all said, I guess we'll take sort of a step back. It would be to this first major claim, which is gender as a discovery process carries a normative weight, encouraging acceptance and experimentation. This is a social good, and the discovery process around gender provides this social good. And so I think we've sort of talked around this quite a bit, but I wanted to go back and just make sure there's time to get into this. If there's more that y'all want to say about why is that a social good? How do we, as a society benefit from this gender experimentation and the discovery process around it?
So there are two pieces to that, I think. The first piece is um, why is it good for the people involved? And then why is it good for society as a whole? And it's good for the people involved because as liberals, we believe in the equal freedom of individuals to pursue their own meaning and values as defined by them. And so we think it's important for people to have autonomy in the way that they live their lives, to be, in Lauren Lamaski's phrase, pursuers of projects. That is, people have larger existential life plans for how they want things to go, and they don't just have shorter term, smaller goals of maximizing utility. but rather they want to, in James Buchanan's phrase, to become who they want to become. They want to self-define and self-identify. And so it's good for them because it allows them to self-express and allows them to be who they want to be. In terms of the social aspects, we think it's good for a society in which many people are able to do that. So in aggregate, you have many people who are able to be individuals and express themselves. And then in that, not only do lots of people then free to express themselves and be who they want to be, but it also allows us to learn things about the nature of gender from those experimentations. So experimentation contributes to social learning. It allows us to understand what gender is, how it operates, what our expectations are of one another, what it means to be in a gendered relationship, what it means to be male or female or nothing or non-binary. And we get to better understand what these social categories are to us, what role they play in society. And so that in that respect, we also engender a social learning process.
And probably one could actually add to that. I think those insights are perfect. One can merely sort of add to that by, probably invoking some sort of idea of dynamic informational theory to say that that human agency with respect to sort of gender expression at an individualized level has a sort of property of the social good to the extent that sort of practices and expressions of gender which happen to be sort of diverse and multifaceted in all of its ways adds to the broader informational set of societal understandings and meanings with respect to gender. So if we actually understand gender to be a socially constructed process as we do, then we would imagine that what emanates from that sort of process of construction is a set of information that people can draw upon with respect to how to be a gendered person in the world, how to live a sort of set of sort of gender identities and expressions. And we certainly do see that markets, not only markets, but also civil society. So both of these sort of arenas or mechanisms provide very important ways in which people can sort of deposit information, as you will, into the sort of the broader world, adding to the informational sort of set of perspectives about gender. So, for example, think about healthcare. Think about sort of how healthcare in its ways of helping to affirm sort of gender identity, and that could be sort of a different gender identity or even the same one. You think about, for example, sort of products like Viagra, for example, that affirms gender identity in a certain sense, right? So that example, let's say Viagra is a medical innovation through markets, right? We don't have perfectly freed markets. I get that, but we have sort of meaningful margins upon which markets are operating to contribute to a situation where freedom itself allows people to add to the informational set of perspectives about gender, and that in its own right has a social goodness.
Thank you. Yeah, that leads, I think, very well into the next area I wanted to cover, which is this idea of social construction and intersubjective meaning. And as I understand it, we're talking about better understanding ourselves, society, our genders through this experimental process. I guess what I want to ask here is, so when we talk about intersubjective meaning, right, we're talking about meaning that is created between multiple people, maybe even a whole society, all at once and all continually. And I guess there's sort of two questions I want to ask here. One is that a good definition, or is there more that y'all would like to add that's important to understanding what we mean when we talk about something being intersubjective? And then from there, I want to talk a little bit about what you all term speech acts and neopronouns. So first, is that a good definition? Is there more that we want to say about intersubjectivity and this particular sort of mode of knowing within society, or mode of meaning creating, however we want to term it?
So I think the thing to emphasize with the concept of intersubjectivity is the word subjective. The fact that people come at the world with their own perspective, their own point of view, and that we exist separately from the world. We are part of the world, but we are also our own individual contained minds that are encased within bodies that relate relate somewhat externally to the world around us. And so when we communicate and relate to other people, we are always trying to get across what it is that's going on in our head that's different from what's going on in their head. And so the process of intersubjective meaning is simply the sharing of different perspectives that then creates a culture and creates a society. So when you have different individuals relating to one another and trying to get across whatever it is that's going on in their head, and how they're understanding the world, the way that they're categorizing it, the way that they're interpreting it, you get the process of what's called intersubjective relations, which is two people or more, at least two people sharing their different subjective perspectives and points of view. And then that helps to constitute the structure of human institutions.
So with all of that said, thank you, Akiva. I think that helps clear it up a little bit. And where I want to go from here is talking about these speech acts that y'all referenced. So when someone decides to start using a new pronoun for themselves, right? What effect does that have in our sort of societal understanding of gender? And I guess the question I want to ask is, do we think that is as meaningful as sort of non-speech acts, right? So one of the things that I see debated less often now, but sometimes in the past it was quite a heavy conversation within the trans community. Is there a difference between someone who, for instance, simply starts using neopronouns and does nothing else to seek a particular gender expression? Is that different from someone who, for instance, goes on hormone therapy or has gender affirming surgeries? How much value do we put in speech acts themselves? And yeah, so if we could get into that a little bit and what y'all's perspective on that is, that would be wonderful.
I think before we do that, we should clarify what speech acts are for people. So
Yes.
speech acts are a concept invented by the philosopher J.L. Austin. And his argument is that certain ways of using words, when you use them, they don't just make a piece, they're not just a form of communication, but they create a reality in the world. So when I say I am a boy or I am a girl, I'm not just saying words. I'm making a statement about reality. I'm making fact. I'm turning something into a fact. Or when someone declares two people married, that sentence, you can now understand yourself as married or whatever, husband and wife or whatever combination of genders you want to use. That creates a reality in the world as opposed to just a series of sentences. And then in terms of thinking about, are speech acts more or less powerful or more or less meaningful than any other act? I think it depends on the person involved, right? Is it important for them what doing that is? For some people, affirming their gender, all that is required is a change in pronouns. For some people, they need to do more. And it's really about this intersubjective thing about, how do other people perceive them? Has other people's perception of them changed sufficiently so that the person involved is seen in the way that they want to be seen? And so the big question is not like, or is one better than the other or one more powerful than the other or whatever. It's really about how are the people who are making changes being understood in society sufficient so that they have the identity that they want to be, sufficient that the identity they want is being affirmed.
Yeah, I think this is my sort of disposition and judgment about these sort of matters as well. We see ourselves as sort of genuine sort of liberals, and so therefore we don't sort of profess to sort of dictate sort of the significance of sort of and weighting of values that other people might attach to their own actions. We accept the inherently sort of subjectivist sort of nature upon which sort of people will make assessments and sort of make judgments, and thereby on the basis of those assessments and judgments act in the world. I mean, we have to acknowledge, and I think we might well be sort of discussing this perhaps a little later on. We do have to acknowledge that that with respect to sort of the sort of, let's say, trans community or the gender diverse communities in general, there are a range of constraints upon which individuals can express their sort of preferred gender identity or reveal their sort of preferred modes of expression, right? There's not only going to be perhaps, and even in some cases, very prescriptive governmental sort of regulations with respect to sort of access to affirming medical care. Now, I appreciate there's a discussion about and a debate about medicalization, pathologization. Sorry, I didn't quite pronounce that correctly, but nonetheless, there is that sort of debate. I'm certainly aware of it, but we have to understand in a sort of a gentle sense that operating within those sort of constraints, and there are also obviously constraints with respect to sort of cultural norms. So when one introduces, let's say, a new category of gender into the world, let's say a pronoun that people are not accustomed to, there might actually be some sort of resistance to that. Why? Because others don't have the epistemological kind of standpoint, sort of position of understanding where a particular sort of gender diverse individual is coming from. So that's going to sort of meet sort of questioning, if not some sort of resistance. But we would posit that in a sort of an open liberal society, you let these sort of things kind of play out dynamically over time. You have to allow really opportunities for people who are, sort of who accept or are agreeable to new meanings, pronouns, meanings of gender identity, to not only to come together with kindred spirits, so to speak, but to actually sort of interact in sort of collegial and mature ways with people who may not come from a point of understanding, including because, they might just reflexively buy or epistemically purchase conventional modes of sort of thinking about gender. So in this sort of world of constraint where, there may be sort of lack of access to things like, care and so on and so forth, or restrictions on the ability to access, we have to sort of allow meaningful margins within which people can express their sort of gender. That may an enunciation of a speech act that sort of declares a gender pronoun may be sufficient in a constrained world. There may be relaxation of constraints. For example, markets over time tend to sort of deliver, if they're not sort of hampered by too much regulation or whatnot, to deliver more abundant availabilities at cheaper prices in the long run. As those sort of resource constraints fall, people may choose to express their gender in an alternative way altogether, maybe even in addition to the declaration of the pronoun. But to take a subjectivist sort of standpoint of this, we can't presume to make declarations about what other people unknown to us might we might wish to do. We want to just merely sort of see as a normative aspect to our inquiry to see that there is sufficient freedom, extensive freedom, for people to be able to discover their own meanings with respect to gender, including intersubjectively with other people if they so wish.
Yeah, this really does anticipate a conversation I have a little further down. So I'm thinking we actually might jump down to that, which is talking about medicalism and this potential for pathologizing. That is hard to say. Different expressions of gender. And so this is one of the main criticisms I sort of saw as worth discussing around y'all's work. There are two that I have laid out here, but the first is this idea that sort of medical or even non-medical intervention can help in pathologizing certain kinds of gender expressions and identities, as well as reinforcing stereotypical dimensions of gender. And I guess my experience with this has been seeing within the trans community a sort of flip-flopping of concern with, we don't have access to medical interventions that we need. This is a terrible thing. Accessing medical interventions tells us that we can only be trans in certain ways. This is a terrible thing. And so it's a really relevant, I think, discussion within sort of trans and gender nonconforming or gender diverse communities. And so, yeah, when we're looking at people's access to medical or similar intervention, what, if anything, can we do to sort of prevent or account for the possible harms around medicalization or around, creating a situation in which access to gender expression isn't feasible for people who, for instance, can't access that sort of medical intervention?
Yeah, so this is actually a pretty difficult kind of issue to navigate, and I think if I sort of take a step back and think about these issues in a sort of very abstract or even sort of broad brush way, it actually reveals to me an important insight that I hope that we're able to reveal in our paper, and that is that sort of gender as a sort of a socially constructed or emergent order is not necessarily one without barriers or costs or sort of struggles or constraints. So I guess my interpretation, not sort of being heavily, admittedly involved in the trans community myself, is that this sort of debate is probably just an exemplar of the very processes that we're trying to sort of study from a sort of an academic standpoint, where meanings and understandings with respect to gender, how one might even appropriately sort of express one's gender or sort of publicize one's gender identity is an ongoing process. And it's a process that is going to involve people with different epistemologies, different values, and so on. And so it's probably the sort of the clashing of perspectives, or just the sort of the thrashing out of where a sort of appropriate lines of sort of behaviors is basically a dynamical kind of unfolding process that has to be sort of played out. Now, I don't have a sort of particular sort of opinion either way about this issue about pathologizing. Oh gosh, that word again. Pathologization. Sorry, I completely made a meal of that phrase. But all I would sort of merely say that from a sort of a classical liberal sort of standpoint that we sort of articulate in the paper, if we actually allow sort of spaces and opportunities where choices can be sort of entrepreneurially generated and sort of made available to others in the world, people can basically pick and choose sort of their own sort of preferred dispositions and orientations and perspectives around gender. So, consistent with that, you'd actually want to see, for example, a process by which sort of the cost of, let's say, of medical and healthcare sort of provision go down over time. And you can really only really do that if you come to sort of understand and act upon healthcare as a freed market rather than a highly regulated one, which is now effectively part of the new commanding heights of the economy, subject to extensive state intervention and control. It's really the state intervention and control which makes a lot of potential care that people may or may not want. It's up to them to be able to access. But the pathologization sort of question is an important one. There's no easy answers, but I think that if you sort of allow, in the end, spaces in which meaningful choices can be exercised, that probably actually goes a long way to sort of allowing people to position themselves whichever sort of side of the debate they wish to choose.
Yeah, no, it's an incredibly complicated issue, and I, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Is yeah, this is one of the things we're figuring out within this process. Is the medical question and all of that. Akiva, was there anything you wanted to add on that particular criticism, or are we ready to hop on? Yeah, go ahead.
I think everything Mikayla said is great, and I'm going to preface my remarks by saying that I am not a member of the trans community. I am a cisgendered person, but I come at this as what I'd like to think as being a friend of the trans community. So just take my opinions with a grain of salt here. But I think what's important and this is, not just a problem for the trans community. This comes in a much larger debate about the definition of health and what health is and what counts as proper medical care. And, when we say that people need medical care for things, are we pathologizing them? And it gets into a much larger, complicated debate about in what Michel Foucault calls like the medicalization of power and turning processes of authority in our society into processes of care in our society into a means of authority in which we can control and dominate other people and make decisions for what's relative and important for them. And so that's always a danger and isn't restricted to simply the fate of the trans community, although obviously that's the focal point for this discussion. I think what's important is that we have experimentation, that people are allowed to engage in different modes of gender performance and gender and how they want to constitute their physical bodies. And then that can provide a kind of conversation about, how much is too much and is there such a thing as too much and what's appropriate or what's not appropriate. And ultimately, it will come down to a kind of intersubjective relational conversation that you have with people about what the expectations are in society. My hope would be that what we do is have as few expectations as possible for what counts as, legitimate gender performance, or that we kind of throw away the word legitimate entirely. And that we simply accept people and respect people for the path that they've chosen to take and the kind of expression that they've chosen to take. And what's important, as Mikayla said, is that people have access and autonomy, and that can only come through, I would say, greater experimentation and greater advancement of medical technology so that people can then have agency over what they want to do and how much they want to do and how invasive or non-invasive that procedure might be.
Yeah, look, I just want to add to that. I think what Akiva is saying is incredibly important, especially his reference to Foucault. And so I would put forward the proposition that that free or freed markets are actually markets that are not subject to domination, right? So you have this sort of philosophical neo-Republican kind of debate about whether sort of markets are too dominating or whatnot. So it's really actually the sort of the state here and the involvement of the state in healthcare and many other sort of ramparts of the economy, for that matter, that actually sort of serves as the sort of the domination sort of factor here, which along sort of various and perhaps even meaningful margins actually prevent people from actually sort of choosing how medical care might play as a sort of factor in their self-determination with respect to gender. Markets as a sort of a non-domination process that allows for sufficient diversity of an array of goods and services at sort of reasonable prices that are accessible to sort of a great many members of the public is very much, I think, consistent with our view, and is consistent with a sort of stance of incredulity towards Foucauldian sort of biopower.
Yeah, this I think really leads well into sort of the next criticism, and I think all of the things that we've been talking about so far really fold into this sort of next question, this next sort of I see as sort of the major sticking point for most people, right, when coming to this work, is that most people are really uncomfortable with sort of transhumanist and freed markets approaches to things, especially when it comes to our medical care. And so one of my favorite topics at the intersection of sort of gender expression and markets is this idea of black and gray markets, and the fact that so historically, like most sort of transhumanist endeavors, a lot of gender affirming medical care was pioneered and even maintained by back alley operations, right? People started doing these things on their own. There was a brief period where institutions pursued gender affirming care, and then they stopped doing that for quite a few decades, and these things moved sort of back into back alleys. And one of the major criticisms I see around that sort of gender affirming procedure, as well as body modification in general, and any sort of transhumanist project, we see sort of two big ethical questions. One is it proper for human beings to be modifying their bodies at all, right? Are there any limits to that? Should we be, not doing X, Y, or Z? And then the second sort of related question is, well, if we're going to experiment with these things, if we're going to pursue these things, is it safe or is it appropriate, right, to sort of trust these to market mechanisms, and even further than that, trust these to sort of black and gray market mechanisms? So I'm sorry I threw a sort of three-parter at you there. But yeah, I think this is sort of the crux of the debate for most people.
Yeah, so I will confess to have a very sort of positive perspective on transhumanism in general. Why is that? Well, just sort of a realization of sort of the empirical fact that throughout human history, ever since sort of the discovery and the use of fire, right through to all these sort of assortments of creature comforts and medical innovations that we have today, humans have modified their bodies and their sort of physical existence from sort of time immemorial. In the paper of Akiva I referred to we referred to sort of Robert Fogel, the Chicago School economist, who talks about techno-physical sort of transitions of the human body over time. And this is sort of reflected in so many sort of things that I would presume any reasonable person would very gratefully and gleefully accept, which is, for example, the radical uplift in living standards associated with improvements in nutrition. the ability to sort of ward off the depredations of a harsh environment, either sort of heat or cold through shelter and other sort of technologies and whatnot. So I'm certainly aware of the anti-transhumanist objection, but I don't really sort of understand whether really sort of accept that the underlying sort of premises of the objections really sort of stack up. We are all of us, all of our sort of contemporaries, you and I, Akiva, we've all been we're all participating in this sort of unfolding process of, you might describe it transhumanism, you might just sort of describe it as improvement in living standards or health standards. We've all been implicated in it, and we substantially benefit from it. And so really, if I sort of take that disposition, it's a very strongly held one, of course, as you can imagine. I don't really see much of an objection to sort of thinking of, let's say, sort of transgender sort of reality as a part of transhumanism, if people want to sort of see it that way. In the end, our sort of disposition is that gender as a discovery process is inclusive of notions where people have an inherent right under their own lights, in accordance with their own subjectivities, and in a sort of a grand societal conversation with other people, to be able to modify and to vary upon sort of conventional, sort of stereotyped modalities of gender to the extent that they so wish. Again, we don't sort of presume or have any judgment call as to what people do, for as long as people are free to do.
So I definitely come from very much the same perspective, and we maybe should have someone here to ask the question or present the criticism from a sort of anti-transhumanist viewpoint, because I too have trouble getting my head around, not seeing the value, right? Not seeing how much the value of this experimentation outweighs the potential risks. I think the other major aspect of this criticism, though, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but the other major aspect of this criticism is the idea that, okay, well, even if we should be experimenting in these ways, we should be trying all of these things, we shouldn't trust it to markets. And I think that comes from both a misunderstanding about what markets are, but also maybe a misunderstanding about what is required for a discovery process to sort of do its work. So I guess, is there anything more y'all want to say about why, markets in this sort of thing? And what I mean when I say markets in this sort of thing, I mean both, products available to consumers for gender affirmation, and the general process of like having this happen within the economic sphere, right, where we're exchanging money for various things that we're trying. I think that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable, and so I guess why should we be comfortable with letting these things sort of happen in the economic sphere, and is that the proper place for these things to be experimented with?
So before we get to that, I just want to add on to Mikayla's excellent comments about transhumanism, and just to say that I think at the heart of the anti-transhumanist perspective, at least from my rather pro-transhumanist point of view, is a kind of essentialism or naturalism about human beings, that there's a certain basic set of biological facts that we come with, and we're supposed to stick to those. And there's a kind of violation, often from a quasi-religious point of view, a sort of violation of the essential naturalness or of our bodies, and so that we shouldn't be making these physical changes because it disrespects our kind of basic selves in some way. And to that, I would simply say that there's nothing essential or sacred about bodies. Bodies are simply containers for minds and for perspectives and points of view. And it's in fact, it's perfectly natural for people to want to improve their standard of living, to improve their physical situation, and to change their bodies so they can be in better alignment with the kind of life that they want to lead. And in fact, I think the transhumanist thing actually gets at some of the debate around gender in general, which is like, does it matter if there's a sex gender distinction? And, is gender a natural fact? It actually doesn't matter if gender is biologically, even if you were to argue that gender is a wholly biological thing. I think that as human beings, we should have the freedom to alter whatever we want to alter in the physical encasements that we find ourselves. And to reassign ourselves into whatever social category we want to, regardless of whether there are biological initial biological endowments at the beginning.
I just want to sort of add to the discussion about sort of markets. So, we've given probably an inordinate emphasis upon markets, and that's all fine and well. But we recognise that markets are sort of one aspect of civil society overall, and so civil society is inclusive of an array of activities, which are not sort of ordered on the basis of profit seeking, and not necessarily ordered by sort of relative prices and several property. Although, we draw, obviously in civil society capacities, we draw upon resources in the world, including some of which are procured in markets. And the sort of, you mentioned briefly, Alex, about sort of black and grey markets with respect to gender, and so that sort of leads us to even a sort of a more nuanced understanding of the markets itself. So markets are not merely sort of represented, or they're not even accurately represented by this idea of sort of inter-firm interaction. If we sort of take Ronald Coase's kind of insight that, obviously firms are organizations, they're not markets, they're basically, little sort of islands of, micro central planning and a sea of broader spontaneous order in the market. But there are different shades of, or different gradations, different kinds of markets altogether. Some of this is expressed, I guess, in the broader macro kind of level literature about varieties of capitalism, but I'm not necessarily referring to that. But I'm reflecting on the fact that there are many different shades of sort of markets at micro and meso levels, and some of these might be actually sort of the underground or sort of shadow economies that sort of you referred to in passing, for example, in which, let's say, hormonal sort of therapeutical treatments sort of are exchanged. So even here there's entrepreneurship. So there's not only sort of gender entrepreneurship sort of at play, to the extent that sort of hormonal therapies will have some discernible effect upon gender identity, if not sort of expression, and how sort of one sort of carries themselves in the world in a sort of a gendered way. But it's also what is called in some sort of recent economic literature as evasive entrepreneurship. So there's a sort of class of entrepreneurial activity that's occurring in illicit shadow markets, admittedly under constraints, because I'd imagine that sort of the sort of shadow economy of HRT exchanges is happening in locations where sort of the formal sort of transactions in the regulated economy are not recognized. And so that sort of gives us evasive entrepreneurship, where you have people who, that if there's a will, there's a way. And so in this case, people are expressing perhaps a different category of entrepreneurship known as evasive entrepreneurship, which then intersects with a sort of gender entrepreneurship. But I think the basic point I'm just trying to convey here is that sort of markets are only sort of one instantiation of sort of interaction, collaboration. We can think about a wide range of non-for-profit, so collective episodes within LGBT communities, for example, that allow people to, in their sort of various sort of spaces, to express gender in ways that they prefer. Not everything is totalized to markets.
So I would just add to that, and I think what Mikayla said is right, that markets it's not a simple question of markets, but it's really about providing different avenues of experimentation. And I think, asking about why markets in a way is in this area is not different than asking about why markets in any other area. So what we might want to do is think about some of the advantages that markets have generally as mechanisms. One of them is experimentation, that different people will try different combinations of resources and it help to make a profit. And because they're interested in making a profit, they're going to steward those resources in a relatively conservative, small c conservative, responsible fashion because they're trying to do well out of the situation rather than to do poorly. And that the profit and loss of a firm reflects its relative ability to serve the public at large, and that profits represent providing value to consumers, at least in some crude way, whereas losses represent lack of providing value to people. And so there are various ways in which the profit and loss mechanisms of markets, the experimentation of markets, the diverse ways in which capital and other resources are applied can allow for innovation and creativity in terms of what types of services are on offer, the pace of change in those services and the improvements to those services, and so on. And so those are some reasons you might want to favor markets in general. And then you can make specific applications to healthcare and to trans-affirming care in particular.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that covers it well from sort of both sides of it's not just about markets. And when we say markets, we mean these particular mechanisms are useful for certain things. And yeah, I think that that really answers the question well, and I think sums up sort of the meat and potatoes of what I wanted to get into today. So unless there's anything major that you'll want to discuss about the paper, the next question I have is sort of a fun one here at the end. So anything else that you two would like to get into with the heavier stuff, or are you ready for a fun question?
Let's get into some fun, shall we?
Yeah.
All right. So I usually ask about music here. Akiva's been on before, and so I've asked him about music, and I think our listeners know that already. So I wanted to get a little more creative with this fun question, and I've been thinking a lot about food these days. I think it's because I'm snowed in and it's very cold, and my crock pot is on most days. So my question for you both, is there a recipe or interesting food in general that you think our listeners should know about that they maybe don't?
That's a top question. So
you can also give us music if that's easier.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about music as well. So I'll talk about both. I think as much as I sort of enjoy being in the US, I do miss the peculiar Australian food. So sort of the Lamington, which is basically like a little square sort of sponge cake, sort of encased in chocolate and desiccated coconut. So that's always a lovely thing. And you might get special Lamingtons with jam and cream. I don't have recipes, but people can Google and even sort of try it out, because in fact within the next few days it is Australia Day on the sort of 26th of January. So if people want to sort of get into some Australian fare, they can that do that, or even miss the old Australian meat pie or sausage roll. But getting into music, I know Akiva's tastes in music, and they're very awesome, of course, and I share quite a lot of the sort of taste. But I guess lately I've been I have a sort of diverse sort of range of sort of music sort of preference. I don't personally get into sort of hip hop or rap or anything of that sort of genre. That's just not my cup of tea, so to speak. But I love. I guess it's a product of my age and kind of betraying my age. I'm sort of a big fan of the old late 80s and early 90s British shoegazing movement. So this is really sort of, sort of strung out sort of guitars and very ethereal kind of sounds. Like exemplars of that would be, the bands like My Bloody Valentine or Ride or Lush and all these kind of, great bands which are in the UK. And it's sort of, the sort of shoegazing has sort of had this sort of brief kind of time in the sun. Then grunge came in, then sort of post grunge, and so on. So sort of came through. You think about. Again, betraying the age in mid-90s, shoegaze really went out of fashion because, in the British charts, there was a big sort of competition between Blur and Oasis, for whose album's going to be on top of the charts. Well, that was sort of mid-90s, and well, by then, sort of shoegaze sort of came out of fashion. But you see sort of something of a little bit of a kind of renaissance here and there. But something else I've been getting into lately is sort of a bit of pop punk sort of genre. There's really, I think, quite awesome Australian band called Stand Atlantic. So they sort of have nice, good high energy pop punk kind of tunes there. So maybe that's sort of something that listeners might like to get into if they're so inclined.
Yeah, I will definitely be trying a Lemington at some point soon. That sounds absolutely delicious. Akiva, do you have a recipe for us or a food for us?
So lately I've been trying to do Chinese recipes that I'm a vegetarian, so combining the same flavorings but with tofu. So I highly recommend people trying out like General Tso's chicken but with tofu. It tastes really good. That's my food recommendation. There's a restaurant near me that does it quite well, but I also try to do it myself. And so it is actually possible to find meat substitutes from most of the things that are out, most of the major foods that are out there, and achieve some pretty great recipes. So I recommend that. I don't have recipes on me, but
well, do you do any special or specific sort of tofu prep for using it that way, or do you just sort of chop it up? I don't know anything about tofu.
I just kind of chop it up and apply the sauce and throw in some vegetables, and it comes out pretty good.
That's always the beauty of tofu, isn't it?
Nice.
I mean, you can just sort of throw it in, and it basically absorbs any sauce that you basically apply to it.
Yeah, and it's a pretty good meat substitute, as are the various Beyond and Impossible and other meats. Speaking of innovation that we've been talking about this whole time, I'm very excited for cultivated meat or lab grown meat. I think that's a very exciting prospect. Because I think it has the possibility to kind of combine the aims of wanting to eat meat with animal welfare in a way that's very promising, and it also has a better ecological footprint. In terms of music, everyone seems to know what my musical taste is, but yeah, I'm the metal fan in the room, and so I'm a big fan of. For the metal fans, I've been listening a lot to a very technical death metal band from, I want to say, Holland. Called Pestilence, and they do some their albums came out in the 90s, but I've only started listening to them now. This happens a lot with me in music, where I'll discover a band from like 40 years ago, and I'll get really into them. And so they're a really excellent death metal band if people like that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I've also been on the pop punk kick. I've been listening to a lot of Sum 41. Sum 41's really great. What else? They're kind of a Zeppelin derivative, but they're a modern rock band, which I like because most of the bands that I like are really old. But Greta Van Fleet is pretty good. Um, they some people think they sound too much like Led Zeppelin. I don't mind it too much. Um, so I'd recommend them. And then there are always the old favorites that I have on my.
We all already know. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my favorite band is At the Gates, and I always can encourage people to check out At the Gates. So I'll put in a plug for them.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like the world, or at least everyone I know, is sort of having a pop punk moment right now. And I don't know what that says, but I think it says something.
Yeah, if I can throw in another sort of recommendation for another Aussie band, if I can. So a band is sort of more sort of hard rock, sort of verging into sort of metal, but they're sort of increasingly experimenting electronically in interesting ways. There's a band called North Lane. They're really cool as well. So Stand Atlantic, North Lane might be some recommendations.
Nice. Well, thank you both for sharing foods and musics. I always like to end on something a little more fun and sort of rest our brains for a minute after digging into such complicated topics. The last question I want to ask you both, and this is, I think, very standard for a podcast interview. What other projects are you all each working on right now? And what should our listeners know about your work? Either more in this area or in other areas?
Yeah, so that's a really sort of great question. So I guess for me, I'm sort of constantly engaging in a blizzard of production of sort of research material within this sort of framework of what you call mainline political economy, which kind of fuses Austrian, Bloomington, and Virginia perspective. So of great relevance to this sort of topic we've been discussing. So I'm looking actually at a sort of book project on sort of queer liberalism from this sort of mainline political economy perspective. So Akiva and I, for example, at the Mercatus Markets and Society conference last year, we presented a paper about sort of queering mainline political economy. There was a sort of session there last year, and we would expect another sort of session on the same topics of what I would call rainbow liberty for this year coming up in October. Looking basically at a sort of grand project, because sadly, and I don't really know why, but sadly, the queer liberalism is just really grossly underrepresented, I think, in the sort of broader queer literature. So there's that. Probably something else I'll mention that might be of interest to sort of listeners is that lately I've been really engaging with the works of Don Lavoie, who is a really excellent radical sort of liberal theorist, and I've been basically applying his ideas to the problems of the administrative state, of which I think there are many. The administrative state, I think, poses as a seriously important problem for a meaningfully and even radically sort of democratic kind of modality of society. And so I'm applying sort of Lavoie's ideas about non-comprehensive planning, about open democracy, as a sort of full-throated critique of the administrative state. But for me, there's a whole stack of stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, I will very much be looking forward to that work on Lavoie. That sounds very meaningful. So yeah, Akiva, what have you been working on? What should we look out for from you?
So I'm not sure if I will circulate this or not. But I just submitted like a month ago, my master's thesis for review, and have been told that it's been graded and accepted. So hopefully, that will come out, and I might circulate it. And that's on open borders and free association. So I've been working on that. And then I have another paper that Mikayla had mentioned that we have this queering liberalism project. So I'm working on that. I have another paper on spontaneous order as social construction that I hopefully will like to get into a journal at some point, but I have had other commitments that have kept pausing that process. And an additional paper on how to negotiate identity in a liberal society, how to deal with questions of identity. And I've written some essays about this question at Liberal Currents that people can check out if they're interested. And so generally the question of whether we should tolerate identity or whether we should accept identities and how to navigate between two different kinds of, I think, equally liberal and equally valid social norms.
Well, congratulations on the thesis being graded and accepted. That's awesome. And I'd never even thought about there being a difference between tolerance and acceptance. So that sounds fascinating. And yeah, with that, thank you both so much for coming on today and talking about this so in depth. Like I said at the outset, this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. So it was very meaningful to get you both on. Before we sign off, is there anything else you'd like to say to the listeners?
Oh, look, I just wanted to thank you, Alex and Akiva, for the opportunity to have a very full-ranging discussion about gender as an entrepreneurial process and as a discovery process. And I trust that people will find our Cosmos and Taxis paper illuminating in various ways. So feel free to get in contact with us.
Yeah, likewise. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about our paper, and always collaborating with Mikayla is always a joy and a pleasure. And so, I'm really glad to have the opportunity not only to write the paper with her, but to do this sort of little media tour of podcasts with her as well. I hope people get value out of the paper, and feel free to get in touch with either of us if you have thoughts or questions.
So how would listeners best get in touch with y'all?
I'm easily Googleable.
Yeah, me too.
Use the magic of Google. Okay.
Likewise.
I will put links in the show notes as well that will make that even easier. But yeah, y'all are easy to find. All right. Well, thank you again. And I hopefully will talk to you both soon and look forward to reading these upcoming works that we just talked about. Bye.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Akiva.
Thanks, Ed.
And thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I thought this was a really interesting conversation to open the year with, and I really enjoyed getting into all the various rabbit holes we did today. Please note that while we will be publishing more episodes of Mutual Exchange Radio throughout this year, we will not be able to publish every month, and the show will be taking on a more open format in this season. This means we'll have a variety of hosts covering special topics that interest them, rather than one or two set hosts publishing every month. We're hoping this will allow to cover us more ground and help our listeners to get to know the various people at work behind the scenes here at C4SS. We're also hoping it will give our editing team enough time to produce all of our shows. On that note, if you haven't yet listened to or watched episode 1 of our new show, The Long Library, be sure to check that out soon. Featuring Roderick Long and Corey Massimino, the show reviews key pieces published by Roderick through the years and is a really great introduction to his scholarship as well as all of the work at C4SS. So be sure to check out that new show on whatever platform you use for podcasts. In particular, the video version is available on YouTube. Our channel is at C4SS Feed 44 or at C4SS FEED 44, or you can watch it on Patreon. If you don't already support the Center on Patreon, now is a really great time to sign up. Not only will you get access to the video version of the Long Library, but we're currently considering new ways to better engage our Patreon supporters and give you more access to C4SS behind the scenes. You can find us at patreon.com/c4ss.org. That is C4SSDOTORG. And you can follow us for free, or you can support our podcast as well as all C4SS projects with a monthly subscription starting at $2. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our current and former supporters, both on Patreon and off, and give a shout out to our producer level Patreon sponsors. So, major thanks to Martin Jacobson, David Colborn, Mikayla Maki, ASDF, Brady P., Jesse Posner, and Tatiana Whitaker. Your generous donations really help us out, and it allows us to produce not only this show, but new things like the Long Library. With that, thank you again, everyone, and I will see you on the next episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. As always, do let us know if there's a topic you'd like to see covered, or an interesting scholar we should have on the show. Bye!